One of the most annoying and frustrating things about politics is that so many people fail to understand the perspective of those who disagree with them. While you can certainly find people of nearly any political persuasion who are both uncharitable and lack understanding, there's good evidence to suggest that people on the left are more likely to be guilty of this than others. As Jonathan Haidt wrote in The Righteous Mind,
"In a study I did with Jesse Graham and Brian Nosek, we tested how well liberals and conservatives could understand each other. We asked more than 2,000 American visitors to fill out the Moral Foundation's questionnaire. 1/3 of the time, they were asked to fill it out normally, answering as themselves. 1/3 of the time, they were asked to fill it out as they think a typical liberal would respond. 1/3 of the time, they were asked to fill it out as a typical conservative would respond. This design allowed us to examine the stereotypes that each side held about the other. More important, it allowed us to assess how accurate they were by comparing people's expectations about typical partisans to the actual responses from partisans on the left and the right. Who was best able to pretend to be the other? The results were clear and consistent. Moderates and conservatives were most accurate in their predictions, whether they were pretending to be liberals or conservatives. Liberals were the least accurate, especially those who described themselves as very liberal.
There are a number of problems that arise from this, one of which is that people try to box you in with their logic to get you to accept their positions, even though you don't agree with their premises. Here's an example of Mike Figueredo from the Humanist report doing just that when it comes to government services.
It's really not radical. It's not radical to think that the government should provide us with basic things. You believe that as well. Otherwise, you think that we shouldn't have roads that we drive on. We shouldn't have a military, right? Because this is the social contract. We give the government our money, our tax dollars, and in turn, there's this expectation that we get services in exchange for that money in return, right? Our government is supposed to protect us. That's why we have a military. We will be secure physically in our homes. We don't have to worry about foreign invaders, right? Now, our government's military takes it a little bit extreme because we are an empire, but in general, the basic idea is we give government money in exchange for services, protect us from invaders, make sure that we have clean drinking water and breathable air. So why can't we demand healthcare? The basic expectation, what is minimally required of government, is to take care of their citizens.
Mike is making a very common error here. I get that he thinks the government should oversee things that are essential. A good number of people think that way. I understand that position, even though I disagree with it. But that's not the flawed logic. The flawed logic is the idea that people like me, despite our skepticism of the government, by virtue of believing that the state should be in charge of things like keeping the peace, we have somehow bought into the premise that the government should be in charge of meeting essential needs for its citizens generally. After all, we need safety, and the government is responsible for that. We also need healthcare, shelter, food, and a number of other things. If the government is tasked with essentials, why shouldn't the government at the very least guarantee these other things, if not produce them outright? These people fundamentally misunderstand how many of us view the government. It's certainly true that just about everyone who believes in government, meaning if we exclude the various brands of anarchists from the equation, think that the government should be involved in keeping the peace. National security certainly is essential, but that's not why we delegate that to the government. It's because national security is a public good. Public good is a phrase that is frequently misused in our political discourse, if it's used at all. It doesn't refer to things that are good for the public or things that the public wants the government to do. In the technical economic sense, public goods are goods, and sometimes services, that, by their very nature, cannot be easily provided by markets. There are two defining qualities of public goods. They are both non-excludable and non-rivalrous. When something is non-excludable, it means that, practically speaking, you cannot limit the benefits of the good only to paying customers. When something is non-rivalrous, that means that one person's ability to enjoy the benefits of the good does not prevent another person from doing so. Let's use this helpful quadrant to demonstrate different kinds of goods in relation to these two qualities, and talk about why it is that most people believe that the government needs to be responsible for the things on the bottom right. Most things are both excludable and rivalrous, meaning, practically speaking, they can be limited from non-paying customers, and one's consumption prohibits another person from consuming it simultaneously. These are known as private goods. My car is a private good. I had to purchase it from the dealership, and while I'm driving it, no one else can drive it simultaneously. Another great example is food. If I go to Subway to buy a sandwich, the restaurant can keep me from having it before I pay for it, and if I'm eating it, you cannot eat it as well. Sure, I can split it in half and give you the part that I'm not eating, but at that point it becomes two separate goods. To the right of private goods, we have goods that are non-excludable and rivalrous. These are known as common resources or common goods. A great example of this is a public drinking fountain. It's out there where everyone can get to it, so it's not limited only to paying customers. However, if I'm drinking from it, you cannot also drink from it simultaneously. In the bottom left quadrant, we have goods that are excludable but non-rivalrous. These are known as club goods. I've also heard them referred to as goods that are artificially scarce or low congestion goods. A good example of a club good is Netflix. Netflix rents out various intellectual properties and will stream them to you as long as you pay, or steal the account of someone who does. However, it doesn't really cost Netflix anymore to stream a show or movie to an additional household, even if people are already watching. If I'm watching Cobra Kai under my account, there's nothing limiting your ability to watch it under your account. Before we move on to public goods, I want to note that rivalry and consumption and excludability are not hardly segregated categories, but in fact exist on a spectrum. For example, a television signal has a low level of rivalry. If I'm watching a football game on my TV, the signal still goes to your house and is not in any way hindered by me watching it as well. However, if you're talking about watching a game in person, viewing the game is non-rivalrous only to a certain point, specifically the seating capacity within the stadium. If you have a 60,000 person stadium, viewing the game live is non-rivalrous up to 60,000 people. After that, if you want to add another person, you necessarily have to take one away. Excludability also exists on a spectrum. If we think about parks, the size usually determines its level of excludability by virtue of the fact that it's easier to guard a smaller space and keep people who don't pay from getting in. Think about it this way. What is easier to keep people out of, Disneyland or Yellowstone National Park? Obviously the former. While Disneyland takes up a lot of space, its borders are much easier to fence off, monitor, and patrol than a gigantic landmass that sprawls over 3 states. It's not uncommon for people hiking in public parks to accidentally wander onto private property and vice versa, demonstrating just how unguarded the borders actually are. And now, let's consider the final quadrant, public goods. They are both non-rivalrous and non-excludable. The classic example from economics of a public good is a lighthouse. As long as the lighthouse is shining its light, it is virtually impossible to keep anyone in the area from seeing it. Furthermore, if I can see the light shining from it, there is nothing stopping you from doing so simultaneously. Or consider the example Mike cited earlier, national defense. Let's say that my house is near a hostile foreign nation that has a bad habit of shooting missiles over the border from time to time. So the government decides to build a missile defense system. Because your average missile tends to have a large blast radius, for my home to be sufficiently protected, the homes around me must also be protected. Furthermore, everyone in my neighborhood can enjoy the benefits of the system simultaneously. This last example demonstrates why governments typically are responsible for public goods. Protection for my home by itself is useless since I'm still vulnerable. Therefore, if I purchase protection from incoming missiles, my neighbors must necessarily be protected as well. In other words, they can enjoy the benefits of the good without paying for them. Of course, if people can get the benefit of a good without paying for it, then no rational person will. And when no one will pay for something, then no one will voluntarily provide it, and no one gets the benefit of it. This is the free rider problem. The solution we've come up with is to force people to pay for these things, i.e., the government taxes people and provides them with the good. You'll notice that food, clothing, and shelter do not qualify as public goods. Hence, there's no need for the government to provide those things since markets are perfectly capable of doing so. The same is true for most things in healthcare. There's nothing about heart surgery or insulin that is non-rivalrous or non-excludable. You could argue, in fact I think I would, that herd immunity from coronavirus is a public good. Therefore, the government, at the very least, has some responsibility to see that vaccines are available to people. But most things in healthcare are not like this. If you think that this rundown on public versus private goods is elementary stuff, you are absolutely correct. This is the sort of thing taught in a typical introductory course on economics. So I apologize if you're already familiar with this. My intent was not to be patronizing here. I wanted to demonstrate how some of us view the role of government and the provision of goods and services. Even if you accept this framework, you're still perfectly free to argue that the government should be in charge of things like healthcare. Many people do think that the government should provide private goods. The state provision of private goods and services is a common definition of socialism. Just know that I'm not logically obligated to agree with you because I think the government should do anything at all. Yes, I think the government should administer some goods and services that are necessary, but that's not because they're necessary. Believing that the government should be responsible for public goods that happen to be necessary is not the same thing as believing the government should be responsible for necessities per se. Now, I should note that not everybody agrees with this framework. Obviously, ANCAPs either disagree with the framework or believe that public goods can in fact be provided by private actors. Also, there are people who believe in government, like objectivist Jerome Brooke, who think that taxes can be voluntary.
I believe that the main source of revenue for government, for free government, would be voluntary. That is, that people would actually write a check to the government because they'd know that that money went to protect their rights. They'd know that that money went for the police force that protected their property and their lives, to the military, which protected them from terrorists and from foreign invasion. They would know that the money was used in their own self-interest. And therefore, they would happily write, I think, significant checks to the government if they knew that that was the sole purpose for which the money was used.
I love Jerome's work, but I think he's wrong about this. Furthermore, like I said earlier, excludability and rivalry exist on a spectrum, so some things don't fit neatly into each category. For example, Mike said in his video that basic infrastructure like roads have to be provided by the government. Many libertarians would object, because obviously you can put a toll on a road and prevent people from going onto them without paying. Of course, that might lead to a cluttered mess in densely populated areas. I'm not trying to adjudicate this matter, I'm just establishing that it is an open question.
But I promise you, homies, you not fooling now libertarian by bringing up them bitch-ass roads. F*** them roads.
Since I don't have a great ending for this video, I'll take this opportunity to plug a group that did some free channel art for me. Thank you to Reason Rising for designing this channel some awesome new art. Their entire purpose is to support and promote lesser known yet top quality YouTubers that deal with all types of political topics by bringing them to your attention, which you can discover on their website. This way small creators get more viewers and you get great content to watch, so please go check out their website, linked in the description box below and in my pinned comment. Have a good day, everyone.